Hey guys, welcome back to another tutorial. Today I'd like to talk about 4 tips to help you improve your editing in Lightroom. Now these tips are based off of my own previous journey and experience with editing over the past few years, as well as the many mistakes that I've made along the way. So hopefully you won't have to make some of these mistakes and you can learn 4 extremely important tips that I think will greatly improve your editing. But let's not waste any time, let's get right into tip number 1. So my first tip is not actually Lightroom or Photoshop specific, it's more of a mindset. Tip number 1 is have a game plan. This is so critical in my opinion. In the past, I used to just wing everything, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that there actually is, but if you're going into an image with a plan, it'll just help you in the long run and give you some sort of direction for your image. Now, when I say have a game plan, I'm referring to sitting down and analyzing your image. What is it lacking? What does it need? What kind of mood do you want? Most importantly, what kind of story are you trying to tell within this image? Now, unlike video, photography, we have one shot to get the point across and tell our story. So really think, what can I do to make this photo come to life? And also, what is the subject and focal point of this image? Now, a lot of times I see a lot of beginner photographers, everything in the image is bright or dark, everything's equally saturated across the frame, which means your eye is everywhere in the image and is lacking a focal point. So if you can think about some of these things before you even get into your edit, then you're well ahead of the curve and it'll greatly help your editing down the road. Tip number 2, don't do too much. Time and time again, I see so many beginner photographers make this mistake, and in Lightroom, we have plenty of options to work with. We have a beautiful workflow laid out for us here, but that's the thing, we don't have to make changes to everything. Now, what do I mean by that is cranking up every single slider. So let's just punch up the saturation, the vibrance, the dehaze, the clarity, the texture, bring down the blacks, bring up the whites. You know, just feeling that we have to hit every single slider. And then it starts getting really nasty looking. And then you might even go down to the tone curve and start adding some additional contrast. And yeah, it's overboard. We don't actually have to touch everything here. Now in the beginning, I get it, you're learning, you need to figure out what every option in Lightroom does. And it is very, very important to go through and play with every slider, see what all options do. I'm referring more to the long run. To show restraint and control and be selective in an image is key in the long run. And this is what's gonna greatly benefit your images. So just keep that in mind for future. Now there are many times where I might make a lot of adjustments up in the basic settings and add a lot of contrast or what have you, where I don't need to go down to the tonal curve and vice versa. Sometimes I'll work only in the tone curve and I won't really make any heavy adjustments up here. So I know we all tend to fall in routines, but I do think it's very important to not do the same exact steps on every single image. I like to look at my images as individuals. Every image needs their own individual treatment. So just going through and saying, well, I always do this, I always do that, and just working on a workflow. It might work for some photos, but I find more often than not, it doesn't. By showing restraint and control and having a game plan, you're already off to a great start. So tip number 3, use more local adjustments. If we look at this image right here, this even goes back to our second tip. I've only brought down the exposure, brought up the shadows a bit, texture and clarity, and I didn't actually touch the tone curve at all. Now, why is this, you're asking? It's because I don't like to make too many global changes. I have a nice base foundation here, just enough, and I'll make the rest of my changes, adding contrast locally and other adjustments locally. So it's kind of a blank canvas essentially, with just minor global adjustments, and the rest will be made locally. So let me give you some examples. At this point, I can add in a graduated filter just for the sky, bring down the exposure, maybe add a bit of clarity, something like that. I can also make another one. Let's just say that I want this side to be warmer and maybe a little bit brighter because this is where the sun is coming. So maybe I'll put some more warmth into the image. Can even go down here and change the color a bit. Maybe we'll actually pull this out more towards the rock. Something like that. And we'll make another one over here. More so just for like the corner sky, we can darken that down a bit. Maybe make it a little cooler. Desaturate it a little bit. Then we can get a radial filter. Now this could be from the sun here. Let me put some more warmth in there. That's too much. Maybe we'll just add a little saturation. But this all ties into our first and second tip as well, having a game plan and not doing too much. So I wanted to emphasize the rock in this area where the sun is coming in as the subject, the main point of this image where I want your eye to go to. By not doing too much, I made minor adjustments, global adjustments here. And now for the third tip, I'm using more local adjustments rather than global adjustments. And by doing so, we're bringing the eye more into our focal point, our subject, and just bringing a little bit more interest and life into this image without having all these changes impact the whole image as a whole. If you control where your contrast is, the whole image won't look contrasty, only certain parts will look contrasty. So in the long run, again, it's really good to start thinking about more local adjustments versus global adjustments. Now tip 4 is subjective. If you're going for the HDR look, that's totally cool. You can avoid this tip. For me, I like to try to keep things a little more natural looking. I want to make sure that I have shadows in my shot and just kind of keep it more organic. So tip number 4, avoid HDR and be careful of the shadows. So in this example, which I used in my last tutorial, you can see that we already have the dark cliff sides and we have a brighter sky. And now if we want to retain the sky information as well as the shadows, well, we have a couple options, but this can get really tricky. Now, a lot of beginners will tend to just bring the highlights all the way back, and then they will compensate for that and bring up the shadows, maybe all the way up to 100. Now, I've seen this a lot, minus 100 for the highlights, plus 100 for the shadows. And yes, we have all this information here, but in my personal opinion, it doesn't look good. It just doesn't look real. So there's a few ways we can compensate for this. So we don't have to push everything to 100 first and foremost. It's okay to find a nice little middle ground in your shot. I wouldn't really push it past 50 on both sides as a general rule of thumb, but right away, this is more of a natural balance, but we're not completely there. At this point, we can add a little bit more contrast back into the scene. Something like that. Maybe bring up the midtone areas slightly. But as much as that works, the sky, I feel like it's not where I want it to be. So I'm just gonna reset this. So let's look at another way to approach this. So I'm gonna bring down the exposure. I'm gonna bring down the highlights. Bring up the shadows a little bit. I'm gonna add a little bit more contrast back into the image with the famous S-curve. But now we're still pretty dark and we still don't have the information that we really want here. So I'm gonna add a graduated filter. And I'm gonna bring down the highlights, bring up the shadows a little bit, bring up the whites a good deal. Maybe bring down the exposure a bit more. Maybe some more contrast. Oh, that starts getting it to pop and look very moody. Yeah, something like that. So now I've darkened down the sky a lot, but we still have some issues with the sides. So now to counter that, I think I'll use a radial filter. And I'm gonna use a range mask for this. I did a tutorial on this. I'll put a link to that in the corner here to show you how to use it. So I'm gonna go really fast with this. Now, to me, this looks a little more natural or real. We still have our dark areas and we can see a little bit of the shadows. We can see more of the detail in the sky. It just seems a little more well balanced rather than just overcooking the highlights and the shadows and seeing details everywhere. In real life, the darker areas will be darker. You wanna make sure that your shadows are shadows, that you're not making them too bright. So by making fine-tuned adjustments, we were able to get more of that natural look and still bring out everything that we wanted to. Again, this all ties back to everything that I've been talking about showing restraint, having a game plan, using local adjustments versus global adjustments, and we weren't too hard on the shadows, giving more of that HDR look. So we had a nice balance. And I keep emphasizing this video, but being selective and showing control or restraint in an image will take you a long ways. And hopefully in this tutorial, you can see some of that come into life. Thanks for tuning in, guys. If you found this video useful, make sure to hit that subscribe and like button, and I'll see you on the next tutorial.